Brought to you by PrayLatin.com, makers of prayer cards featuring complete English phonetic renderings of Latin pronunciations.
Periodically, the powers that be of the world like to put the church on notice. We saw this a lot during Vatican II, specifically with the media, chiming in and putting pressure on bishops to accept the radical breaks from church history that were being proposed in those documents. Many of those documents made the bishops very uncomfortable, but they went along with it, believing that there was widespread support for such changes among the laity and among their brother bishops. This was an illusion created by the media at the time and helped to create the situation that happened once the council was done, which was unbridled chaos reigning on the church. We see a similar situation today. An article was published on Christmas Day that I want to talk to you about now. It's from one of the most balanced, moderate outlets in all of the English-speaking world, the UK Guardian. I was being sarcastic in describing it as moderate, of course. They are very much a progressive news outlet. They wear their bias on their sleeve, and that's fine. I actually appreciate when news outlets are pretty upfront with their bias. But here they practically put the church on notice. They are telling us what the agenda for the church in 2024 is going to be, calling it one of the most momentous years in recent church history, one of the most important. They even claim that some of the events going on in 2023 and 2024 in the church dwarf Vatican II and how important they are for the future of the church and the agenda and the need for reforming the church. Because we are told here in this piece that we're going to go over now that the church is in desperate need of reform. Again, secular outlet telling the Catholic Church that she must be reformed. One wonders if they've ever thought that maybe they themselves need to reform, themselves interiorly, to submit themselves to our Lord Jesus Christ and let him work on them interiorly what he has done for so many souls already, and let him lead them wherever he may. Probably not. That probably doesn't typically occur to outlets who tell the church to reform from the outside. Let's go over this story now. Headline from the Guardian. The Guardian view on the Pope's reform project. The world's largest Christian body needs to change. That's news to most of us, but here we go. Quote, after a difficult year in which he underwent surgery and suffered periodic illness, there was another flurry of concern in November over the health of Pope Francis, who turned 87 this month, meaning December. Suffering from acute bronchitis, the Pope canceled his trip to a big summit in Dubai and twice asked an aide to read out his remarks at weekly audiences in the Vatican. Ahead of the most important year in the recent history of the Catholic Church, well-wishers must hope that the temporary loss of voice was not omnipotent. Next autumn, the biggest ecclesiastical listening exercise ever undertaken by a pope will come to a contested climax, dwarfing in scale the modernizing Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. Pause. That's a very big admission, by the way. The last great progressive moment in the history of the Church, again, another big admission. Francis' Synod on Synodality has canvassed the views of millions of parishioners on every continent over its future. In the autumn, an interim report described this unprecedented exercise as a, quote, radical call to build together an attractive and concrete church in which all feel welcome. Next year, following a final conference in Rome, it will be down to Francis to flesh out the detail of what that means. Loathed and actively resisted by the powerful conservative body in the church hierarchy, the synodal project is both the intended centerpiece of Francis's papacy and the primary motivation for him to stay in office despite ailing health. The fate of long-standing liberal causes, such as greater roles for women in church ministry and the welcoming and validation of James Martin Catholics, depends on it. Amid emptying pews, a dearth of vocations, and a crisis of authority deepened by the scandal of the Ted McCarrick problem, the future of Roman Catholicism in Western liberal societies is at stake in its deliberations. End quote. I'm glad we have the Guardian to straighten out what the church needs to do and to let us know how bad things have gotten in the church. That's the secular media for you, though. They will stack up all these accusations of the church to remind us why we need to change. That we are the ones who are not conforming to reality and to what is right, good, and just in the world. That is their message for us. And that we must fall behind Francis, fall in line with him, and do what he is trying to do, because he has been sent, apparently, by God to reform the church. There are many true believers in that. Remember, There are a lot of Catholics who believe that Francis and his coterie of villains don't actually believe anything and that they just want to change the church for some nefarious purpose. That is actually not giving them enough credit. They are true believers, which makes them far more insidious. They truly do believe, at least many of them do, that God sent them to reform the church. He wants them to change the church. This has been a problem in the church for decade upon decade upon decade. There were true believers in the hierarchy at the time of Vatican II who believed that they were there to change the church. That it was their God-given mission to change the church. There's a lot of logical problems with that, of course. Not that, of course, that they would ever accept that. Let's get back to this, though, because this is incredible. Quote, a common struggle. By and large, and with good reason, left-leaning opinion has been supportive of Francis, refocusing the church after the traditionalist papacies of John Paul II and Benedict XVI. I guess we're setting the bar pretty low for what counts as a traditional papacy, and that's not an insult at those two. They're not. They weren't traditionalists. He, meaning Francis, has tirelessly fought the corner of those who move around a lot in an increasingly hostile environment and become one of the world's most influential voices on the urgency of the thermometer problem. But the awkwardly named Synod on Synodality has been treated as an internal affair and received modest coverage in the non-religious media. That may be short-sighted. At a time when Christianity is being used as an implement to promote toxic divisions in Western politics, the battles being played out in the Vatican are part of a wider struggle to defend and develop a politics of generosity and inclusion. It is, of course, true that Western populations continue to lose touch with the formal trappings of religion. Paradoxically, however, the worst kind of authoritarian religious sensibility, intolerant of dissenting views and contemptuous of pluralism, is penetrating the political space to an alarming degree. And I agree with them on that, but they don't mean from their own quarter. They mean they're pointing at people like us. An important new book entitled The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, American Evangelicals in an Age of Extremism, the journalist and author Tim Alberta charts the extraordinary success of the previous president in courting evangelicals who look like most of the viewers of this channel with an apocalyptic version of Christian identity. In an interview with an Atlantic magazine this month, Alberta described the growing influence of Manichaean worldview that has been skillfully channeled by that former president. A, quote, prism that's no longer red versus blue, conservative versus progressive, God-fearing Christian versus godless leftist. It's good versus evil. Throughout Francis's decade-long papacy, the same observation has been applicable elsewhere. The Orthodox Church, under the malign leadership of Patriarch Kirill, has become a prop for the bad guy of the moment and his ambitions to erase his neighbor from the map. European politicians such as Orban and Meloni invoke Christian authority for an aggressive agenda that has threatened to undo much of the victories of our secular opponents on those who can move around, and, of course, the James Martin crowd. In that context, the battle to reform the world's largest Christian organization matters. As a counter to the deployment of religious dogma as a political battering ram in the world, Pope Francis has compared the vocation of the church he leads to a field hospital after battle, tending the existential wounds of the vulnerable. But as Anglicans have discovered about the James Martin pairings issue, translating that kind of tolerant vision into meaningful reform is a challenge. Beyond the first major synodal summit in Rome in October, Francis stated that the church has to change. It's about a change of growth in favor of the dignity of people. Over 400 Catholic clerics and lay leaders, including for the first time women with voting rights, duly gathered to discuss what such a fully inclusive church might look like. But to the acute disappointment of many lay observers, a published summary of those conversations failed to explicitly address the status of the James Martin crowd or the ordination of women. An open letter of protest signed by, among others, the former Irish president, Mary McAleese, judged that, quote, prophetic voices won no significant concessions from the powerful and wealthy forces of conservatism, end quote. That article goes on and on and on and on like that. That is what we are dealing with now. Remember, the Synod on Synodality is not actually over. We're just in an interim phase right now. It picks back up again in the fall, in October of 2024, on the feast of St. Francis of Assisi. Like Francis likes to launch these things every year. And the outside world is watching. Probably will be watching much more closely this fall than they did last. After all, that article just put everybody else on notice that they weren't paying that close enough attention. They probably will be now. But that, folks, is what we are dealing with in the church in 2024. Do not turn your eyes away from these stories. These are going to continue through Lent and into the spring and summer. We will continue to be dealing with this, and we will be here at Return to Tradition continuing to cover these stories, which is why if you have ever thought about supporting the work of this channel, now is a great time to start. Links in the description box below. I'm curious what you think about this, though. Do you think this is the secular media putting the church on notice? Fall behind Francis. Do you think this is them putting the church on notice to continue this work? Don't ignore all these important issues that you didn't address in this document, because they were right. That final document was all about listening and group hugs and talk, at least on the surface. What that article doesn't really address is that that final document from the recent phase of the synod was meant to institutionalize a process, and that process was lay influence and decision making. We're going to see more of that in the coming synod in October, and we're probably going to see that in the coming conclave, because there's going to be a conclave. Francis won't be around forever. There will be one in either this year in 2024, or there will be one in 2025. 2026 maybe at the outside latest. But there's one coming. And there has been strong talk about having laity participate in it, making the next conclave the first synodal conclave. Let me know what you think of all this in the comments, please. And hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. So to sharing this on social media, that helps a lot too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.